Finally, let's come to the topic of the Apocrypha. Should we include the Apocrypha in our Bible? Now, I'm going to list off 4 points that Wayne Grudem makes in his systematic theology. I'm going to add a point or two to that and kind of give a little bit more detail than he does in his systematic theology as to why non-Roman Catholics reject these books. Number one, they do not claim for themselves the same kind of authority as the Old Testament. So when you read the Old Testament, so the Apocrypha would be sort of an addition to the Old Testament. Catholics will want to call these deuterocanonical books, second canon, but they don't speak with the same kind of authority that Old Testament books do. So you can hear, like again in Jeremiah, "Thus saith the Lord" is a powerful statement, and you'll see it in Isaiah, you'll see it really all over the New Testament, where these are the words that the Lord himself has spoken through a prophet. Contrast that with like this quote from Maccabees. So in Maccabees chapter 9 and verse 26, "They made inquiry and searched for the friends of Judas, and brought them to Bacchides, who took vengeance on them, and made sport of them. So there was great distress in Israel. Such had not been since the time that prophets ceased to appear among them." So the writer of Maccabees is acknowledging that the prophets have already ceased. This is not the sort of thing that you would expect if he's claiming the same divine authority as the prophets in the Old Testament did. Secondly, the Jews rejected the Apocrypha. I mean, they thought it might be instructive for reading and learning, but as far as like scrolls they would lay up in the temple, they wouldn't include the Apocrypha. They would not include those books. And when Josephus, when he enumerates the books that are used by the Jews and considered authoritative, he gives 22 books. These 22 books line up with the 39 that we have now. They just divided them up differently, and they did not include the Apocrypha. So the Jewish rejection is the second reason why I would say that I should not consider the Apocrypha on the same authority as we do the Old Testament. And another reason for that is, again, at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that Paul says that unto the Jews were committed the oracles of God, and the Jewish people themselves recognized that these were not part of the oracles of God. Thirdly, Jesus and the apostles did not quote from the Apocrypha as Scripture. They never use the same formula like "it is written." They don't quote from the Apocrypha and give it the same and invest it with the same kind of authority that they do the Old Testament. So the fact that the Jews of that day and Jesus and the apostles did not treat the Apocrypha as Scripture, that is a telling reason for us. Fourthly, there are historical errors in the Apocrypha. So let me just give you one. It was the 12th year of the reign of Nebuchadnezzar, who ruled over the Assyrians in the great city of Nineveh. This is historically inaccurate. Nebuchadnezzar did not rule over the Assyrians. He ruled over the Babylonians. This is just a historical blunder. So it can't carry the same authority that the Old Testament does. Finally, even the early church. So the early church had the Septuagint, which was a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible. You might call it the Old Greek outside of the Pentateuch. But they used what's commonly referred to as the Septuagint, and it did include some of these books. So there were people like Augustine and some others in the early days who wanted to include these as Scripture. So even in these early days, the people who understood the history of the Jewish people best, people like Jerome. Jerome was commissioned to translate the Latin Vulgate. There's letters going back between him and Augustine about whether to translate for the Septuagint into Latin or to translate from the Hebrew Bible. Jerome maintained that he needed to translate from the Hebrew Bible, and Jerome knew that the Jewish people did not see the Apocrypha as Scripture, and he went ahead and translated the Apocrypha. He made it clear in his writings that these should not be treated as Scripture. So we have 5 good reasons to reject the Apocrypha. One, It does not claim for itself the same authority as the rest of the Old Testament. 2, it was rejected by the Jews. 3, Jesus and the apostles do not treat it as scripture. 4, it contains historical errors. And 5, the early church, the ones who knew the most about it, tended to reject these
books.
people. And again, I'm not talking about, I keep saying early church, and I wish I had a better term for that, but for 200, 300 AD, 400 AD, the people who knew the most about these things rejected it. And even Catholic theologians through the history of the Catholic Church also rejected these apocryphal books as actually canonical books. I mean, even the man who interviewed Luther on the Catholic side, basically trying to see if Luther was still Orthodox, even he himself did not see the Apocrypha as scripture. It wasn't until the Council of Trent in the 1500s that the Catholic Church officially accepted these books. So what happened with the Reformers? The Reformers revisited the question of the canon of Scripture. Now, it should be noted that Catholics, Roman Catholics, and Protestants, and pretty much every major Christian group accept the same Old Testament and same New Testament. The real question between Protestants and Catholics is whether we should include the Apocrypha, which I just did that section about why I don't think we should include the Apocrypha. But they agree on the New Testament and the Old Testament. But the Reformers went back and they wanted to see, did the early church make the right decisions? They re-examined these, and by and large, I mean, you have some odd comments from Luther. Luther is a little skeptical about the James. But once you get past Luther into the Reformed tradition and beyond, all of these 27 books came to be recognized, and the Apocrypha was regarded as it was for most of its history as instructive, as useful, but not authoritative. That was a view of the Reformers.